What's up, guys? I'm back. As requested, I'm going to do a small video on how I do the rusty, weathered look to certain model parts. Main thing I start with is going to be, just keep this in the camera view, Vallejo German gray. It's the dark gray, not that fuel gray. 70995. I'm about out of this. Sometimes I go with straight gray. Sometimes I add a little bit of like chestnut or blood tracker or some other little bit of brown to it to give it a darker rust starting out. And it's the sponge technique to start with. I'm just going to do a little shoulder pad I got for this Vigilant I'm working on right now. Like a little stringiness in there. Alright, you want to just start off a couple little random chip marks. And also you want to make sure that you actually overlap a few of your decals. If you just hit areas where there's no decals, so you want your decals to show, it's not as realistic. Chipping is going to be over, you know, stickers and insignia and all that stuff also. It makes it a little more realistic. It gives it depth. It shows it's on top of things. Usually I'll get a couple little areas on the main body, and then I'll try to get a little up at the top, and especially down in the bottom, like where the right near where the creases are. I try not to touch the trim piece. This is just a little start. I'll go back in and refine a few of these with a brush after I get the little speckly look to it, the little chipped effect. Yeah, I'm gonna try to keep this in camera and see it at the same time. You don't want to completely cover your decal, but you do want a little bit of edge overlap. Now, one weathering effect, I mean, if you want to go for serious weathering, sometimes you can go back with your base color, but not as hard to find weathering deal, and kind of stamp over it, and it'll start building up the base color over the decal and make it appear as if it's a faded decal. It's, you know, most of it's being rubbed off or chipped away, but that's only if you're really wanting to go with a heavy weather. That's about good for that right there. But then I'm going to come back in, find you a brush, old brush, anything, a little tiny brush, and I want to refine some of these larger chips, especially right around the bottom edge. I don't want to go all the way down to the trim. I want some of that paint to be left over in the bottom, because you know your trim has a depth, and if something was going across the trim, it's going to leave that paint down in that crack. It's going to miss it, but it's going to wear away at the paint that's above it. Might want to do a little random one in there, a little larger chip. And of course, sometimes you can go down in these cracks on the gilding and get down in there. And up at the top. This doesn't show up as good on the darker colors. That's why sometimes I'll add a little rust to it if it's a really dark palette, so it stands out right off the bat. Once you start adding the rust, it'll start popping out. And while I got this, I'm going to show you a little thing I discovered. You know, a lot of people will use a tiny brush to do the little scratches in the paint. Well, I found something I call tattooing, basically. You need a real sharp X-Acto knife, one that's got an edge to it. So if yours is like dull, you might want to sharpen it up, or basically the way a knife sharpens, it's got a bird edge. If you rub something across that, it'll stand that burr back up and give it a sharp edge again. Now with that same gray, I'm going to water it down a little bit because I don't want it to be thick on the blade. I just want a little bit to adhere to the edge. I'm going to draw that knife through it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it don't. You got to go back. Yeah, see, it didn't work. You got to get a paint on there, and then you're basically slicing the paint. It's tattooing that scratch into it. When you come back later to do the bottom edge highlight, the fact that you have a scratch there is actually going to help that paint shoot down the line. It's kind of like taking a liquid paint and putting it in that crack. It's going to flow. It's easier to make the damage. Like I said, it don't always work. You got to do it a couple times sometimes. Just little random marks. And when you got a dark color like this, sometimes it's almost pointless to do the dark line. You just want to come in with your highlight line and do it, because the dark line's not really going to show up in the first place unless you're crossing something, say like this decal. Then you might want to leave the dark in there. You can do the same thing with the edge texturing. If you've got a silver edge or even a gold edge, if you want to use that ring vein silver, liquefy it a little bit, you can do silver scratches in it. And it makes for perfect straight lines instead of sitting here tediously trying to make a straight line that always inevitably ends up hooking at the end when you're trying to pull away from it. Now, what I'm going to do is I use P3's Blood Tracker Brown. Now I get little bottles and I end up transferring paint to bottles because it's so much easier than using pots. I mean, I've got a ton of pots I haven't done yet. That's just because I'm lazy. I tend to do it once I start using the color. If I'm going to be using it enough, I'll go ahead and transfer it. But with that, I'm going to add a little bit of that to the gray. Water always helps stuff blend. Excuse the fact to say water instead of water. I'm a little bit country. Alright. This brush still might be a little too big. I'm going to come back with a little bit finer tip, because you're going to go in and you're going to start working probably about 50% of the way into it. From the bottom, you want to add that rustier, darker aged rust look. Hit the little spots. You don't have to worry about all the tiny little dots. Just the areas that are big enough that you can actually put paint into. I'm trying to keep this in camera. I mean, sometimes I actually go down to the edge of the trim, but a lot of times I don't. Whatever your own preference is. It's a pattern, and like always, it's up to you. But if you want, you can either go out and find stuff yourself, like rusty farm equipment and bulldozers. You got a phone. If you're going along and you see something that looks cool, like oil splattered on the side of a truck or a tractor or anything like that, a rusty spot on a vehicle, take a picture of it. It's good research. Good thing to look back on if you're trying to do a realistic look. I'm only working with one piece here, so I'm going to And the next thing I do is I actually go back with just straight up blood tracker brown. And I come up probably about a quarter of the way. And you can do that little puddled look because it splotches the rust around. It might look a little bright, but as soon as it dries, it actually tones down. It doesn't look as bright once it's dry. It can be a time-consuming and tedious process, but it's all about the end result. And at this stage, I usually try to test the streaking with just the pure blood tracker. See if I can get it. Sometimes it don't work just right, but you want to kind of get most of the paint off your brush. And this is like just, I mean, graze the paint. Don't do it heavy. Just let that tip. Sometimes at the end of a scratch. I'm hoping you can see this and it's not too glared. Yeah, I hope you can. This camera, I might be at the wrong angle for the screen to look at it myself, but do little streaks. It's not showing up as good until you get to the lighter rust on this dark. Now here's another little trick. When you're working with a light color, something like bone, white, or anything, it would tend in nature to show rust a lot easier than darker colors. And rust bleeds, especially if you have light colors. It'll tend to migrate away from the rust spot. So one thing you can do is if you got any kind of pigments, Secret Weapon, I have Forge World stuff, so let me find take you a Q-tip, just regular old Q-tip. And I keep a tray of powders that I've wet and dried. I mean, if they're dry out, they'll re-wet again. But you just want a little bit of that light rust on your Q-tip. And rub the area around the speckle. And it'll simulate that bled out rust. It'll tint the paint around the rust area, give a little bit more realism to it. It won't show up as good on the darkers. It's more for like a light color, white, cream, bone. Oops, sorry. Now, once that stage is done, is when I go in and I do the edge highlighting. For this, the cream color, I'm probably going to go with just like, this is a Reaper linen white. It's not quite white, not quite cream. And here's where you want a fine edge brush. And that one's too fine. There it mainly hitting the bottom of the rust area. Oh, I gotta switch glasses. I need the ones that are a little bit more magnified. You want to get under the edge. And when you have these little dots, you can actually just touch on the bottom of each one of these little speckles. I mean, it don't have to be perfectly lined up with it. The effect overall to the eye, you want to hit them little chips. Get underneath them. Sometimes you can go all the way around them if you want. But the idea is to catch the bottom edge of them. When it comes to a line, you don't want a real wet brush. You want a slightly dry one because it's easier to drag it along it than all of a sudden have a puddle trying to form. This one isn't working quite the way I wanted it to, but it's hard to do this in front of a camera too. It'll build up and you'll get that brighter bottom edge. Hopefully now y'all understand what I go through to get these models the way they are. It's a time-consuming process. It's a little slower when you got a camera in your face and you're trying to keep the item in the screen and you're not used to it. I really hope y'all can see this and it's not too glared. Because if I go to watch this and all I see is glare, I'm going to be so upset. It's hard to make it perfect, especially doing it this way, but the whole idea is to edge it. You're brightening that bottom edge of that chipped paint. And where it crosses something like a black decal or a darker spot, you'll want to go back in there with like a little gray or something and highlight that crossover too. I tend to go around most of the chipping instead of just the bottom. We get you an old model piece and practice that that scratching effect, or what I call tattooing of the paint. Because you're basically tattooing it. You're putting a scratch in it and dropping pigment in that scratch along the way. That's the cream. For this green, I think I'm just going to go with straight Elysian green or Elysian green, whatever it's called. Fresh bottle. I've actually never used this color before. I just got this about a week ago. I think actually in anticipation of this model or this commission. Sometimes I would just take a base coat and lighten it with a little cream color to get to what I wanted, but as for brightness goes, let's see, there's too much water in that. This is about right, point on, or on point, as you would say. With these darker colors, it's hard to see where that gray's at without tilting it to where you can see the shine where the paint was dropped on. It's basically the same technique. I'll finish that so I can make this video a little shorter, but after you get that in there, it's time to go back to your Blood Tracker Brown, and I usually add just a little bit of Fire Dragon Bright to it. It's going to give you a lighter rust color. I can't teach you technique of what to do on how you mix your paints and all that stuff. That's just your own preference. Then we're going to come in and get at the very bottom. And kind of stipple it a little splotchy. Like there's rust coming through. Yeah, my battery's dying on this thing. Oh crap, I gotta hurry up. But this is the gist of it right here. You get that bottom, that brighter, and then you can come back in and streak that. Give you a little newer rust. Try to go back on top of the lines you've already done with the darker rust. And when you get to that, you can liquefy it a little bit, and where it would normally run down on the trim, just let it run along that edge. We got to build up a rust. Where it would naturally form in those bottom cracks after running down. Tiny little streaks in a few of the speckles. Alright guys, well this thing's about to die on me, so I'm going to go ahead and end this right here. Hopefully you can see the whole thing without glare. I'll know as soon as I watch it, but if you want any tutorials or tips on anything else, let me know. But basically this is how I do my rust, and it's a time consuming process all over the entire model. Oh, one other thing real quick. I made this little card up I was going to show you. Hopefully I got enough time. When you're doing something like a rhino, or anything that has a metal side or an edge that likes to plow through things, and you want to get that effect of streaked paint, you can do your little edging, but you can also use that same piece of sponge and streak it like that. You just pull it across like that forward edge of the vehicle, and you've got the scratch effect in the paint. I'm trying to do this quick, but you get the idea. And you'll get an edge chipping, or a scratch chipping, or scuff chipping. Like I said, that's a poor example. I'm trying to hurry. Alright, till next time, like my page, keep posted, like my YouTube channel, spread that around, and I'll add as many videos as are requested. Later.